You swore you would never do it. Then one day you find yourself in the middle of an argument and hear your father's voice coming out of your own mouth. Or you realize you are going silent exactly the way your mother did when she was disappointed. Something goes cold in your chest when that happens, and it is not because you are a bad person. You feel that way because you recognize the pattern, and recognizing a problem without having a map to fix it is a very specific kind of suffering. This video covers 10 signs that the script is already running in your life and explains what is actually happening underneath the surface when it takes over. Here is what is actually going on when that moment hits you. Your brain learned a script before you ever had a say in the matter, and I mean that literally rather than metaphorically. The neural pathways that control how you respond to conflict or closeness were laid down when you were small. You watched the adults around you and absorbed their patterns the way dry ground absorbs rain, which means you did not choose the script at all. You inherited it. For a while, you might feel like you can outrun it. You read the books and go to therapy and make conscious decisions to do things differently because you think awareness is a form of protection. It feels like knowing the problem should be enough to stop it. But here is the thing nobody tells you clearly enough. Awareness is not the same thing as regulation. You can see a pattern coming from a mile away and still walk straight into it. Because recognition lives in the cortex, while reaction lives somewhere much older and faster. By the time your thinking brain identifies what is happening, your nervous system has already fired, and the script is already running. Terry Real calls this adaptive child behavior, which refers to the strategies you develop to survive your family system that now show up uninvited in your adult relationships. These behaviors worked once because they kept you safe or functional in an environment where you had no other options. The problem is that these strategies do not update automatically, so they keep running long after the original threat is gone, like an alarm that stays armed after the intruder has left the building. Gabor Mate makes a similar point in his work on stress and development by explaining that a child's nervous system does more than just learn behaviors. It calibrates itself. It sets a baseline around what the environment required, whether that was scanning for threats in an unpredictable home or withdrawing because closeness always came with strings attached. Those calibrations become your default setting, and defaults do not care about your good intentions. When you hear your parents' voice coming out of your mouth, you are not looking at a character flaw. You are looking at an inherited calibration that never got interrupted. The research on intergenerational transmission is clear that everyone has these patterns, so the real question is, which ones are running, and what happens in the gap between the trigger and your response? That gap is where this whole video lives, because it is the only place where change is actually possible. Most people who struggle with being emotionally unavailable didn't actually grow up with cold or mean parents. Instead, they had parents who simply went quiet or changed the subject whenever things got heavy. These parents got busy or focused on practical logic right at the exact moment when someone in the room needed something softer and more human. You watched that happen over and over, and you eventually learned that feelings are just a problem to be managed rather than a signal to be received. Because the adults around you modeled distance as the normal response to emotional weight, you learned that the best way to handle a difficult situation is to step away from it. Now, when your child cries, or your partner feels overwhelmed, or a colleague breaks down at work, your brain activates that same old strategy. It isn't coming from a place of cruelty, but it looks like distance to everyone else. You start trying to solve problems when they actually just need your presence, or you tell them it will be fine when they really need you to sit in the hard part with them. You find yourself leaving the room, either physically or emotionally, right when staying would actually cost you something. The real sign here isn't that you don't care about the people in your life. The sign is that caring feels dangerous to you, and you don't fully understand why that is. When John Bowlby conducted his attachment research, he mapped this out precisely by showing that when a caregiver is inconsistently available, a child's system learns to suppress its own needs just to keep the relationship alive. You learned how to not need too much and how to manage everything alone. And now, you are accidentally teaching that same painful lesson to the people who need you most. The point of realizing this isn't to make you feel guilty, but to give you a sense of precision. If you can see the pattern clearly and recognize that emotional weight triggers your urge to withdraw, you can start to catch it earlier in the sequence. You won't do it perfectly every time, but the gap between the trigger and your response will get a little bit wider. And that tiny fraction of space is exactly where your freedom of choice lives. This pattern runs incredibly deep in high-functioning families where the parent wasn't absent, but was instead relentlessly present and constantly correcting. Every mistake you made became a teaching moment, and every failure turned into an opportunity for feedback. The message they delivered was rarely malicious, but it was always the same. You could always be doing better than you are right now. Now you find yourself doing the exact same thing to the people you love. You watch your kid draw a picture and your first instinct is to point out what looks wrong. Or your partner tells a story at dinner and you interrupt just to fix a tiny detail they got wrong. When someone proposes an idea in a meeting, you've already catalogued 3 reasons why it won't work before you've even processed whether the idea is actually good. The drive underneath this behavior isn't a sense of superiority, but a deep-seated anxiety. Your parents corrected you because imperfection felt like a threat to their image and their sense of control, and you absorbed that anxiety the same way you'd pick up an accent from the people you grew up around. Now, whenever you see imperfection in the people close to you, it trips that same old alarm in your head. When Diana Baumrind researched parenting styles, she found that high-control environments produce children who carry fragile self-esteem into their adult lives. This didn't happen because the parents were trying to be cruel, but because constant correction communicated that the child's natural state wasn't good enough. You aren't trying to recreate that environment, but the pattern has its own momentum that makes the correction arrive much faster than the connection. The people receiving it learn the same thing you did, which is that the only way to stay safe around you is to perform correctly first and be a human being second. Before you offer a correction, try asking what that person actually needs from you, because while they might need the advice, they more likely need to know you saw them before you judged them. Your parent never had to scream to let you know they were disappointed because they had a much more effective tool. They just went quiet. You could feel the temperature in the room shift and the air pressure drop as they withdrew, which left you spending hours or even days scanning your brain for whatever mistake you made. You were desperate to find a way to fix things, but the silence kept you locked out. That kind of quiet teaches you a very specific and painful lesson about how the world works. It tells you that love is conditional, and when you mess up, the person who matters most to you will simply become unreachable. This is one of the most disorienting ways to control another person, because it is so hard to name. It just looks like someone being still, so there is nothing to point to and nothing to complain about. Yet it feels like a wall has been built between you. Now you find yourself doing the exact same thing to the people you love. When you feel hurt or overwhelmed, you shut down and stop reaching out. You pull back in ways that you probably couldn't explain if someone asked you to. But the people around you feel it immediately. Those who already struggle with anxiety start that same internal spiral you lived through as a kid, and they begin hunting for their own offenses while trying to earn back your presence. The science behind this is actually pretty startling. Research on social exclusion shows that the silent treatment activates the same pain pathways in the brain as physical injury. You aren't yelling or breaking dishes, but the nervous system of the person on the receiving end registers a threat just the same. Their body reacts as if they are in physical danger because, to a human being ignored by a loved one feels like a matter of survival. The real question you have to ask yourself is whether you are taking space or delivering a verdict. Needing time to think is a healthy and legitimate boundary, but weaponizing that quiet is a different story. If the people in your life feel punished by your absence, rather than understanding that you just need a moment, you are likely following that old script you inherited. We've already named 3 signs, The point is not to memorize them, it is to notice which ones actually repeat in your life. This video is sponsored by Senda, the AI journal that shows you the patterns and blind spots shaping your life. Most journals help you get the thought out. Senda helps you go back in and surface what keeps repeating across entries. Try it free for 7 days through the link in the description. Now, the next sign is harder to catch because it looks like calm. Some parents were famous for never losing their cool. They stayed measured and reasonable at all times, but somehow that felt even more terrifying than if they had just started yelling. The control itself was the message, because it told you they were holding something back that was so massive and so dark that you weren't allowed to see it. You learned that emotions were things to be managed and hidden rather than felt. You got very good at performing this same kind of composure. In the middle of a fight or a high-pressure situation at work, you look completely fine to everyone else. Your voice stays level, and your face remains neutral, which leads people to call you unflappable, as if it were a compliment. They think you are the most stable person in the room, but they don't see what is happening under the surface. The truth is that your nervous system is running red hot while you maintain that mask. Your jaw is tight, and your stress hormones are spiking as you track every single variable in the room to manage the outcome. You are burning an incredible amount of energy just to keep the performance going, and eventually, that pressure hits a breaking point. It might not be a dramatic explosion, but it shows up as a sudden irritability or a deep exhaustion that you can't explain. In his work on trauma, Bessel van der Kolk points out that you can train yourself to look regulated without actually being regulated. The gap between how you look and how you feel is where chronic exhaustion lives, and that performance costs you something every single day. Even if nobody can see the price you are paying, your body is keeping the score. The people who are closest to you can usually sense the tension anyway. They might not be able to put a name to it, but they feel the pressure vibrating behind your calm exterior. Children are especially tuned into this frequency because they don't care if you look calm. They only care if you actually are calm. When those two things don't match up, they feel the instability, and it creates a sense of unease that they carry with them. This is the flip side of the last sign, and you might find that both of these patterns show up in your life depending on the day. Some parents never learned how to contain their feelings, so they broadcasted them to the entire house instead. The whole family ended up organizing their lives around whether dad came home in a bad mood or if mom was having a rough day, which turned the living room into a place where you had to check the weather before you dared to speak. You became an expert at reading invisible signals, like the specific way a door closed or a tiny shift in someone's tone of voice. This kind of hypervigilance isn't something you chose out of nowhere, but rather a survival skill you developed, because predicting an adult's explosion was the only way to stay safe. Now that you are the adult, you might find yourself carrying that same emotional weight into a room and letting it radiate outward until everyone feels it. It doesn't have to be a dramatic scene, because sometimes your anxiety just leaks out until the people around you start feeling on edge without even knowing why. When you feel disappointed, the energy in the room shifts to accommodate you, mostly because you were never taught how to process your internal world before bringing it into a shared space. Your parents never learned that skill either, so their personal weather became the family climate, and you grew up thinking that was just how emotions were supposed to work. The clearest signal that this is happening is when the people closest to you start regulating around you instead of with you. They are busy managing your temper or your sadness rather than sharing their own lives, which creates a dynamic where you are now the one generating the storm everyone else has to hide from. Your parents probably loved you deeply, but that love likely felt much more available when you were winning. You felt the warmth when you got the right grades or made the team, but things turned cold the moment you failed or needed something that didn't fit the family image. It wasn't that they stopped loving you entirely, but the sun seemed to go behind a cloud the second you stopped performing, and nobody in the house would admit the temperature had dropped. You walked away from childhood believing that love is a wage you earn through effort, and now you likely apply that same logic to the people in your life today. You might notice you are more affectionate with your partner when they aren't adding to your stress, or perhaps you are more generous with co-workers who make you look good. This withdrawal of warmth isn't something you are doing on purpose, but it is the same conditional dial your parents used, and now it is installed in your own personality. When researchers like DC and Ryan look at conditional regard in self-determination theory, they find that it forces people to outsource their entire sense of self-worth. Because approval is always moving, that internal feeling of being enough never actually takes root. So the person spends their whole life performing to get a scrap of validation. They become completely dependent on outside signals just to know if they are okay, which is a heavy way to live. You likely built that same architecture inside yourself, and it is probably still running right now. It's the part of you that works way harder than necessary or feels uneasy when things are going well, as if you haven't quite paid the price for your own happiness yet. The people you love most might be building that same internal structure because of the signals you are sending, even if you never intended for them to feel that way. Your parent never really trusted the process of struggle, so every time you brought a problem home, they met it with a solution before you even had a chance to sit with the discomfort. They meant well because they wanted to protect you from wasted time and the messy inefficiency of learning through difficulty. But the message they sent was that your struggle was intolerable to them. What they communicated without meaning to was that the natural, slow, and sometimes circular way a person works through something hard needed to be managed and resolved immediately. Your job wasn't to actually experience the difficulty, but rather to get past it as fast as possible, so the adults around you could stop feeling uncomfortable while watching you fail. Now that you are an adult, someone mentions a problem and you find yourself generating solutions before they have even finished describing what happened. When your kid comes home upset about a friendship, you are already mentally planning how to intervene before they have even told you the full story. Your partner expresses a little frustration at work, and you are 3 steps deep into unsolicited advice because the impulse feels like genuine care. The message this sends is the same one you received as a child, which is that you cannot hold space for their process and you just want to end the tension faster. Carol Dweck's research on how we develop a tolerance for difficulty makes a point that usually gets missed when people talk about her work. The part that actually matters here isn't just about praising effort over outcome, but rather a parent's ability to stay present while a child struggles without rushing in to collapse the tension. That specific tolerance is what communicates a real belief in someone's capacity to handle life, while fixing it immediately communicates the exact opposite, even when that help comes wrapped in warmth. This interruption isn't complicated to describe, but it is incredibly hard to feel. Because sitting with someone else's unresolved difficulty activates the same discomfort your parent couldn't tolerate. The reflex to fix things is usually just a reflex to relieve your own anxiety. This sign doesn't look like much from the outside because you are technically in the room, you aren't on your phone, and you haven't physically left the conversation. However, you are running a conversation from 3 hours ago in your mind, or you are anticipating tomorrow, or you are tracking some low-level anxiety that never fully settles. The part of you that would register another person as actually being present has gone somewhere else entirely, and you are just a ghost in the room. Your parent may have been exactly like this, where they were home but not reachable, or in the same room but clearly somewhere else behind their eyes. You probably remember the specific loneliness of being near someone who wasn't actually tracking you, where the physical proximity made their absence feel stranger rather than better. Now you find yourself at dinner composing an email in your head, or you are playing with your kid while your mind is already at the office. You are in a conversation with someone you love, but what they said 3 days ago is running in the background and pulling your attention sideways. You are present enough that no one can quite point to the problem, but you are absent enough that they feel the distance anyway. Children do not measure presence by physical location, but instead they measure it by whether you are actually tracking them and registering them as real and specific and worth being here for. When your attention doesn't land on them, they draw the same conclusion you drew as a child, which is that they aren't enough to pull you fully into the moment. That conclusion lands in their gut long before they have the language to describe it. And once it takes root, it tends to stay there for a very long time. Your parent carried worry in a way that signaled constant danger to everyone in the house. Maybe they were vocal about it, telling you to be careful or warning you that the world doesn't give second chances, but they might have just held that tension in their body instead. You grew up around a low, constant alertness and a baseline expectation that things would eventually go wrong, so you naturally absorbed that same calibration. Your nervous system learned how to scan for threats before you even knew what a threat was. Now you receive an ambiguous text message, and your mind generates a dozen different interpretations before the next notification even hits your screen. Most of those guesses are bad, just like when you make a small mistake at work, and some part of your brain starts building a scenario where that one error unravels your entire career. If your kid runs a fever, you find yourself several steps ahead, imagining outcomes that you know are statistically unlikely. Your logical brain knows these fears aren't realistic, and it tells you so quite clearly. But your nervous system doesn't care about probability. It sorts by pattern instead, and the pattern says that because someone in your early life was always braced for impact, you need to stay braced too. The people in your life now absorb that frequency without ever knowing where it started. Children especially learn that the world is something they must guard against, rather than a place to move through with curiosity. This specific trait might be the one running underneath every other sign we have talked about today. Your parent likely held you to a standard that they never actually put into words, yet they enforced it with total consistency. Nothing was ever quite right, things could always be better, and there was always something slightly off about your performance. You internalized that critical voice so completely that it stopped feeling like something you inherited from them, and now it just sounds like your own inner thoughts. You tell yourself it's just high standards or self-awareness, and you convince yourself that you're just not letting yourself off easy. The truth is that you are hearing the voice of someone who was never accepted for who they were. Kristin Neff has done extensive research on self-compassion, and her work makes a structural point that goes against everything we usually assume about success. People who are harshest on themselves aren't actually more successful or more motivated than anyone else, but they are much more likely to be avoidant and prone to shame. When they fail, they tend to abandon their goals entirely rather than adjusting and moving forward. That internal harshness never produces the results it promises, and it only serves to recreate that familiar feeling of never quite arriving. The people around you absorb this energy, even if you never say a single cruel word to them. The impossible standard you hold yourself to sets the atmospheric pressure for every relationship you have. Everyone in your orbit learns that falling short is something they have to manage carefully when they are around you, which is exactly what that inherited voice was built to do. Every one of these 10 signs follows the exact same blueprint, and it usually starts with a pattern that was installed in your brain long before you had any say in the matter. That behavior probably worked well in its original environment, but now it runs on autopilot, firing off faster than you can even notice it in situations that barely resemble whatever created the habit in the first place. The problem is that recognition almost always outruns regulation, which means you might watch yourself falling into the trap, even while you are right in the middle of doing it. Most people get stuck in that frustrating gap between seeing the pattern and actually having the power to stop it. So they end up beating themselves up or deciding that this is just who they are. Having more insight won't close that gap on its own, because more insight without a real structure just gives you a more sophisticated way to describe the same old loop you're stuck in. To actually change a pattern, you have to catch the interruption early enough and often enough that a new response becomes just as automatic as the one you inherited from your past. This process requires you to track your behavior over time, creating a map of what trips the wire and what the sequence looks like before the engine starts running. A pattern you have mapped out stays visible to you, whereas a single moment of realization usually fades away. If you saw yourself in more than a few of these signs, the next question you need to ask isn't how to stop the pattern, but rather what that pattern is still trying to protect. These mental scripts do not run without a reason, and because they were adaptive once, Some part of your system still believes they are necessary for your survival.